Yes, no. You can do this if you need to check your email.
Okay.
So, sorry, we're still trying to get a few more people signed in here. He tweeted too, so I tweeted back to him. Okay.
Yeah.
So, we added him. Let me just do this then. Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
well, hopefully other people will join. I'm Chris Pickett. I'm the current Science Policy Fellow at ASBMB. I'll just give a little bit of background about myself, and then Geoff can introduce himself. I did my undergrad at the University of Colorado, and then I went to the University of Utah, and where I got my PhD. And I graduated from there in 2006. Then I went to Wash U, where I did my postdoc. And that whole time I was studying C. elegans and various processes in C. elegans, most recently aging and reproduction. And then it was over the last few years that I developed an idea that I wanted to go into policy, which eventually led me here. So I'll just keep it brief at that, and I'm happy to answer more questions about my background or what brought me here later on. But I'll let Geoff introduce himself.
So my name is Geoff Hunt. I was the policy fellow between 2010 and 2011. And I am now the public outreach coordinator for the society. I got my PhD from Princeton in 2009, and I had taken a couple science policy classes while I was in grad school, just on a whim to see what I like and if I'd like it, and then found out I liked it, applied for the fellowship. They somehow hired me, so I stuck here, and then this job that I am in currently now opened up when the fellowship finished, so that's my story. So that's our background, and I'll let Chris talk a little bit about what the fellowship entails, and then, or if you guys have questions, just fire them at us. That's fine.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of a background about the fellowship. It is a 12 to 24-month fellowship, so there's plenty of time to get immersed into policy. As the policy fellow, you work with Director of Public Affairs, who is Benjamin Korb. So he's my boss. I go to him whenever I have questions to ask. If there's anything I can't figure out, or if I need guidance on anything, then I just go to Ben, and we figure it out. It's really a great relationship. Geoff worked with him too, and seems to like him.
Yeah. It's all right.
So in addition to Ben, we also work with the Public Affairs Advisory Committee, which is a committee of 15 PIs from around the nation and different parts of their careers, who are interested in policy and passionate about it and want to get involved in the path of science and policy. So the committee itself changes every year. People have certain term limits, so the PAC that Geoff worked with is not the same as the PAC that I worked with. So most of the work revolves around what the PAC wants to do, whether that is organizing meetings up on the Hill or with other various agencies around the area, or interacting with other organizations. So I actually want to just jump out in front of one question, which I almost always get, which is, what is a normal day like for a policy fellow? And Geoff's kind of laughing because he knows that everybody asks this question. And the question is really hard to answer because there really isn't a typical day for someone in science policy. There's a lot of writing involved in policy, whether it be writing emails to members of the PAC, our advisory committee, emails to members of Congress and their staff. It's also writing blog pieces, writing pieces for our newsletter. There's a lot of different levels of writing, and there's always something going on. And there's also going to meetings, whether it be on Capitol Hill, in various agencies, buildings near and around the White House, NIH, things like that. So every week looks different. Every week has different meetings, different things, different deadlines. So just hoping to jump out in front of that question there. Do you have anything to add, Geoff?
I would agree.
All right. So then I guess we will open it up for questions.
I guess I had a question about the fellowship or application process itself. Like, what do you guys look for in a fellow applicant, and what can someone who is interested in policy or this particular fellowship build up their resume to be more competitive for the application?
So Geoff, do you want to answer that? You've been through the process.
Yeah, I mean, what we're looking for, it's changed a little bit since I was hired and since I was involved in the hiring process, but you do need to demonstrate some level of experience with policy issues and not just sort of a broad knowledge of them. You also have to demonstrate an ability to communicate effectively, and that can be in several different ways. A lot of policy, as Chris said, is writing, so being a good writer is especially strong skill to have, and demonstration of that is very important. There's also a lot of face-to-face interaction that you do, and so being able to converse with members of Congress, with members of the administration, with members of leadership at federal agencies is very important skill. And so demonstrating those kinds of communication skills is also something that's really important. Everybody who's going to apply for this is going to have a very strong science background. So you need to have something that sets you above your experience in the lab with teaching that everybody is going to have.
So, and I mean, Geoff's been through it because the fellow helps hire the next fellow. So Geoff has applied and he also helped hire another fellow. For me, I've only done the application part of the process, and I can tell you that from my vantage point, what you really need to do is come across as being passionate about being involved in policy, and that this is really a career transition for you from the bench to policy. Because if you are coming in and it's not clear, maybe you are considering going back to academia, or maybe you just want to try it out, you know, nobody's going to want to invest a year in you in teaching you how to do policy if then you're going to, you know, turn your back on it and go back to academia. So in addition to everything that Geoff said, you also need to communicate that this is a transition for you, that you are moving into policy and your career is going to be in science policy and not bench science anymore.
And the reason for that is any bench scientist can get involved in advocacy and policy. The Public Affairs Advisory Committee that Chris mentioned, those are all bench scientists who are involved. And so that's great, and we love people who are involved and are dedicated and are willing to make that kind of sacrifice to take on an additional responsibility. But with the fellowship, the understanding is that you're going to a career away from the bench.
How many applicants do you guys normally get?
It varies. I think a couple years ago we had 30 to 40 applicants. There were less last year when Chris was hired, so it ranges. The job market obviously dictates a lot of that, but also just the interest level that people have in the fellowship.
And you guys will always just pick one person every year?
Correct.
Okay. And then I just had a quick question, which I emailed Chris about, but on the website it says that you can't be out of your postdoc for more, it can't be more than 3 years after you got your PhD. So I got my PhD in October 2008, so am I just automatically, like, is that something that's used against me then?
That's not going to be used against you. Really, we are trying to guard against someone who's been away from their PhD and has done something for like 10 or 15 years.
Okay.
We really want people who are somewhat close to their PhD, 4 or 5 years away. I'm sure we wouldn't turn someone away for that reason.
Okay.
So,
yeah, Chris, how many years out were you?
Yeah, I was 5 years out of my PhD.
Okay. Okay.
So he made it in.
Okay, so
Sorry, I think, Wynn, if you're trying to talk, we can't hear you.
Yeah, and you must be muted somewhere.
Yeah, you're muted. We can't hear you. Sorry. You can, if you want to send the chat in on the Hangout, try that and see if that'll get the question in. Was somebody else asking a question?
yes.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned that you need experience. What type of experience are you looking for?
it's not one thing. It could be that you have interacted with your member of Congress before in some way. It could be that you have had some sort of training in policy. It's just showing some. It's the point of that as a requirement is that this isn't just some sort of fad that this might be interesting, but something that you showed a dedicated passion for. As Chris said, that's something that you're going to follow up on with all of your energy, and not just, I think I'll try this out just because it sounds interesting.
Yeah, for me, I was actually on the job market for 2 years, so I tried to, get my policy credentials increased the first time around. So I had a few things on my CV, and then the second year I had even more things, and those were things like just setting up a meeting at your local congressional office and going to talk to a senator or representative staff about the importance of science in the community and in the state. I also went to a couple of Hill Day events, which ASBMB does. The spring one is already full, but we bring people in from around the nation to meet with their legislators here in DC. You can also monitor the NIH, because often they will put out requests for information about a bunch of different topics, whether it be the workforce or big data initiatives or things like that. And you can take some time in yourself if you have ideas about it and respond to them. You don't have to be an organization like ASBMB or a university or anything like that. You can respond as a person. So that gives you a great way to think about policy and write about policy and that kind of thing. It does take a lot of time to respond to one of those, so that also shows dedication to that topic. And so there are a few ideas. You can also write to your letter to the editor of your local newspaper. There are a lot of ways you can get involved. So like Geoff said, there isn't just one way to do it. If you take classes or you do any of those other things, it looks good on you.
Sure. I see we have a question from Twitter. The question is there any conflict for the fellowship if you were actively involved in an advocacy group at the time you apply? I would say no. That's great. It shows that you have some sort of dedication to the process.
Yeah, I was a member of a couple of different organizations when I applied. So again, it just shows that you're interested and dedicated to it.
Yes, I have a question about, could you tell us about your challenges when you make the transition between a bench scientist to a policy fellow? What do you encounter during your first year to be a fellow?
Yeah. So okay, I'll start. It's very different from bench science and just the whole lifestyle. Some good things. I had no idea what to do with myself on the weekend because the office was closed and I couldn't get in, and I didn't take any files home with me. So what was I going to do on the weekend? Enjoy the beautiful weekend and spend time with my wife? That seemed crazy. So that's a good type of challenge to have, of trying to budget your time so that you get everything done during the workday at work, and you don't take anything home from you or with you. As far as the learning curve is really steep, and there is a lot of stuff to get done, and you have to hit the ground running. So, especially my first few months were just a blur, because we were setting up a Hill Day, which is in conjunction with a couple of meetings that we do at NIH, as well as the PAC coming in for a business meeting. So we were making materials for all of those. It was trying to learn all those materials, learn where things are in the computer so that I could manipulate them. Really, it's just a ton of information that you get thrown right at you right from the very beginning. And I mean, the people around here are very nice, but you also there is some degree of you have to pick up the pace and make sure that there isn't a hiccup in it. So that can be pretty daunting. I came in, one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give is to pay attention, and whether that's like reading Politico or checking in on it every day or just being aware of what's going on in politics and policy is a huge boost. So I came in and I knew vaguely what the committees were that were important for making legislation for science. So I didn't have to try to memorize which committees go where and things like that. So that kind of basic knowledge coming in is a benefit. It's not required, but that will smooth the transition a little bit. What do you think, Geoff?
Yeah, I would agree. It's completely different from working at the bench, but that's kind of why you're getting into it. and it's just a different way of thinking. But there are similarities. You know, when you're working in the lab, you're working a lot on your own and coming up with stuff yourself, and there is definitely a certain level of autonomy for doing this job. Like Chris said, you have to learn initially from people what you're supposed to be doing, but then a lot is sort of expected of you on your own. You're not going to have your hand being held the whole way through. Anybody who's, you know, been in a research lab knows how to pick things up pretty quickly and to sort of motivate themselves and get themselves working on stuff. So it's a different kind of experience, but it's one that you can take to pretty quickly. I'd say, like Chris says, it's sort of a trial by fire the first couple months to get everything sort of up and running, and once you're there, then you have it under control.
Sure. And can you elaborate on the mentorship that you receive during the fellowship there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, luckily for Chris, I'm here, so he can ask me questions about what things were like. Ben is great at sort of bringing you into the system and sort of explaining what he needs. He's not going to hold your hand and, you know, write every little thing out for you, but he will show you the ropes of what you need to do. I think, you know, my first Hill meeting was within a couple weeks of starting here, and he was like, all right, your turn. And I think same for you probably. We also work with a number of different coalitions and other societies in a lot of partnerships. The DC area is all about advocacy and different organizations involved with that. So you get to meet with them, and you get to learn from those people who are all, for the most part, very helpful and willing to sort of help you along.
Yeah, I'd also say, I mean, Ben is really good. He won't hold your hand, and he won't, you know, write you a list or anything, but he's also not going to be, you know, royally pissed off if you don't get anything done on time. You know, if you mess up and you talk to the media and say that science should take up the entire budget, he's probably going to be a little bit upset with you. Other than that, you know, he's really good and very patient and understands the transition that you're trying to make into policy. I'd also say that the fellowship is set up, like I said at the beginning, it's a 12 to 24 month fellowship, and that lead time after 12 months is because we hire a fellow every year. And so whoever is the next fellow would overlap with me, and I'm going to pass on everything that I know to the new fellow. So you're not only learning from Ben, but you're also learning from me. So I have clearly a direct experience of transitioning from the bench into policy. So I think the setup here, in addition to having Geoff around, is really great as far as being able to learn from people in policy and interested in science.
All right, we've got another Twitter question. Does the fellowship entail learning how to advance our own interest in policy, or is it more structured to only ASBMB goals? So I would say that since you're working for ASBMB, you're going to be focusing primarily on the interests of ASBMB, and as Chris mentioned, the PAC, the Public Affairs Advisory Committee, is the one that's driving the society's policy agenda. However, you are encouraged to bring your own interests in different areas to the fellowship and to the office. Our former fellow before Chris, Julie McClure, was very interested in STEM education issues, and she really pushed that and got us signed up with a number of organizations that are involved with that area, sort of tried to push the policy agenda to include those kinds of topics more. So it's both of those, but I'd say it's more focused towards the society's interests.
I'd agree with that, especially in the first 6 to 8 months when you're here, just because you are trying to catch up with everything. And, you know, we normally have a meeting of the PAC in September, so there's a lot. If you join in July or August, then there's a lot to get done in that short amount of time, and then there's a bit of relaxation. You can start looking at other topics of interest, but then we have another PAC meeting in March. So pretty quickly you're turning around and trying to do that whole thing again. So that first 6 to 8 months, you're really just learning and trying to figure out what's going on in policy. And it's after that second PAC meeting in March, and you know, Julie mentioned this quite a bit, that she really had no time to take a breath until after that second PAC meeting, when that was all behind her. There were a lot of other things that she could focus on then to figure out what she wanted to do at the next step of her career.
How easy is it to transition then to like from this fellowship to a job, say in DC and Capitol Hill?
It depends what you mean by easy. After you're done with this job, you will have skills covering a lot of different bases. And so you'll be able to apply for jobs that involve government relations, that involve working with agencies and universities, that involve outreach and education. The question is just on availability of those jobs. Another issue is it's tough in the policy world because a lot of people are looking for people with experience. I mean, that's a big thing. And you'll get a lot of breadth in your experience during the fellowship, but you obviously don't get a lot of depth because it's only the 12 to 24 month period. And so transitioning that experience into a full-time job is a matter of opportunity, and you'll sometimes see a lot of jobs. Like I applied for a lot of jobs in addition to the one that I have now, and I would say, look, I hit everything on your list in terms of what you're looking for, but they say, well, we need somebody with more experience, 5 years, 10 years experience. And so it's something that you just sort of have to face, but you'd have to face that with any job.
Yeah, but that said, ASBMB fellows have been pretty successful at getting jobs. We had one guy who I think still works in a congressional office, in the senator's office. Yeah, he just got done there. We have another, Geoff is here, Julie, who we mentioned, moved on to another organization that's similar to ASBMB. And we've had another person who has had a number of different positions, including positions at the NIH and other organizations like this. So really, if you want to be in policy, this position gets you a lot of experience and can open a lot of doors. It depends on which ones you want to go through.
And did you receive any support from the ASBMB during your process to apply for a position or during your career development when you are at the fellowship? Chris and Ben?
In terms of, the whole point of the fellowship is to get you trained and then get you a job. And so it is in their best interest that you are employed after this fellowship. And so Ben will do everything that he can. The rest of the staff will do everything that they can to get you the job that you want. DC is all about connections and networking, and so you just have to tap into that network and use it the best that you can. And there's a lot of support. Nobody wants to see anybody fail. Nobody wants to see anybody not get a job. And so you'll have a lot of support. It's just up to you how you use it.
I actually have a practical question for the application. When you're transitioning away from academia, a lot of times PIs have a mindset of academia is the only place for a scientist. As long as you have other good references for the application, is it important that your current PI be one of those references?
I would say it's not necessary, but it always raises a question when you're applying for a job about about why your current boss isn't recommending you for something. And I understand the stigma that's attached to applying for a non-academic job and trying to get a reference from your academic advisor. But I feel like my boss in grad school wrote me a letter, and she wasn't against me doing it, but she wasn't exactly 100% supportive. But she just wrote to my attributes and said, this is what I think of Geoff.
Yeah, both my postdoc and graduate advisor both wrote letters for me. I think it's dicey as to whether or not you have on what we would think if you don't have a letter from your PI. So actually, okay. Yeah, actually, I lost my train of thought. I don't think it would be, if you don't get that letter, I don't think it would be terrible to put a small note, like just a few sentences of why there isn't a letter from your PI. If it really concerns you, if you think your other letters are going to be super strong and it's not going to be a problem, then I wouldn't mention it.
Okay.
So we have a special guest. This is Ben Korb. He's the Public Affairs Director. He's who you will be working for. So Ben, why don't you give a little background on who you are and what you do?
I'm Ben Korb. I'm the director. I actually Chris works for me. Geoff did at some point in time. I've been watching from my office, listening to your questions. So I just wanted to make myself available for a couple minutes if you guys had specific, like the last application question. I might be able to help you and give you some insights, since I'm the guy who's reading and making some decisions in terms of who gets the next level of interview and that sort of thing. So wanted to make myself available for a couple of minutes if you had any questions. I didn't want to interrupt too much, because I know there are probably questions you want to know more about the transition from your lab work to policy work. But if you guys had any questions for me, fire away.
I have a question regarding to the application process, and for sure that Geoff and Chris, they are successful candidate to be selected to the position. So for Ben, what characteristic that you seen in these two candidates that make them distinguish themselves from other candidates?
We had to be damn good looking.
Obviously.
They send me flowers too, which is helpful. Honestly, the best candidate for me is someone who, look, I can tell you, having gone through this process now, for 2 years, having reviewed about 60 or so applications from people who've been interested, everyone that applies for the job is a very qualified scientist and a very skilled scientist, and knows infinitely more about the science than I ever will. What separated Chris, what separated Geoff, what separated Julie, was their ability to go beyond what they've done in the lab and really to exemplify what they were able to do in the policy world. And even if they hadn't done anything, their interest in doing stuff beyond just the lab. I don't need someone who is just a scientist. Hey, it looks like I'm wearing that guy's hat.
Yeah. You can wear the hat if you want to.
I don't need just a scientist. I need someone who has the ability to communicate, someone who can explain to me what it's like in the lab, so I can understand the impact that things would have back out in the field, that the field that I've never really been in personally, and someone who's willing to go just kind of beyond, is more than just a scientist. And so that's really what I'm looking for, and those applications that really exemplify things. Our previous fellow had a letter of recommendation that talked about how she argued with her professor and her professor's daughter over lunch constantly about just politics, and that was interesting to me. We've had applicants who didn't tell us this outrightly, but we found out in the process that they had been on HGTV on a sewing television show. The things that, again, I will get lots of qualified scientists. I want people who are qualified individuals and are more than just what they've done in the lab, and so that's what I get drawn to.
Thank you.
How different is your fellowship compared to other organizations that are offering a similar science policy fellowship?
I think the nice thing that we have, AAAS obviously is one of the bigger fellowships here in the city. The nice thing that we offer is you get experience in all of the different pieces of advocacy. So if you get a AAAS fellowship and you're lucky enough to be positioned in a member of Congress's office, that's great, and you get a lot of in-depth examples and experience in a congressional office, but you don't really get involvement with the administration or with marketing or writing or those sorts of things. This fellowship gives you an introduction to the entire policy world. So on one day you may be doing meetings on the Hill, another day you may be going to the White House to go to a briefing, and on the third day you're going to be catching up on writing that we need to do for ASBMB today because we're 3 days late, submitting an article that we need to do, which never happens from our office. But I think the neat thing that we offer you is experience in all of the different things. Because I know if you're transitioning from the lab to come here, it's because you want to get a job in policy, but I'm willing to bet you don't exactly know what that means. And so what I want to do is give you as many opportunities as possible to experience the different things, to figure out what your next step is going to be. Because unfortunately, this step isn't going to be your permanent one, and we recognize that, and I want to introduce you to and make you as ready for that next step as possible. Geoff had no interest in going to the Hill after his fellowship, which is perfectly fine. Julie, our previous fellow, didn't really want to didn't really want to go to the Hill, and so she's in another society doing similar work. The fellow before Geoff has been in the Senate since he had left. So we want to make you a very qualified candidate for whatever your next step is, and I want to help you learn so that you know and becomes more clear to you what your next step is.
What specific policy topics do you does your organization actually work on?
It depends on the day and the time and what's big in the news. If you turn on the TV and hear about sequester, I guarantee you we've been greatly and deeply involved in sequester and the impact of budget cuts on science. It might be immigration policy. That's an issue that we're obviously very interested in because of scientists who immigrate from another country to come here and do their research. Travel, the ability for scientists to travel on government funding is something that's important to us. Animal usage in research, the workforce, the future of the workforce, training, diversity. There's a whole multitude of areas that we're interested in and involved in. And if there's an area that I didn't mention that you are interested in, there's a pretty decent chance that you're going to be able to build some tasks for yourself in that area. And we're going to let you go ahead and do that. Chris is very interested in STEM education policy. And so we are, working to get more involved in that area, mainly because Chris is going to be driving the boat on that.
And going back to what I'd said at the beginning of what a standard day is for the fellow, there may be a day where you work on all of those different policy aspects for the society, and then there may be another day where you get instead of them because something flared up. So it's a very varied experience being the fellow, where you can work on a whole host of things even in the span of a day.
For more experience with writing and just understanding policy in general, do they actually have either journals or websites that actually show how policy writing comes out, so that we can see taking our actual scientific knowledge that's more narrow and examples of how you adapt that for policy writing and communicating to other people, whether congressmen or other people that don't understand all the technical aspects?
Yeah, I would say the first thing you can check out is our advocacy page. There are a number of position statements and press releases that we've put out that put into context a lot of scientific issues within the larger policy framework, and those are things that Chris and Julie and I have all worked to develop.
If you actually want to do something on your own and think about your own work, the challenge you should give yourself is set a timer for 1 minute, and then start the timer, and in that time explain why your work, or what the problem is and why you're working on it, the discoveries that you've made, and how they're going to improve human health. 60 seconds isn't a long time, but you can do it in that amount of time. So if you want to learn, just teach yourself more about communicating in a more policy fashion, then that's one of the things you should be able to do, is talk about science within a 30 or 60-second time frame. Because really, when you go up to Capitol Hill, you have a 15-minute meeting, and you don't want to spend 12 and a half minutes talking about why this worm is crawling around the plate in a certain way, or a fly is doing something different. You want to tell the congressperson why your work is important, and then you want to move on to whatever you're there to talk about, whether that's science funding or if that's any other issue that we might be talking about. So that would be one way that you can improve your own skills in advocacy.
And the thing that I would add, and this is something that I've always asked when our fellows are writing, is to think about who the audience is. So this is just kind of a skill to remember, even if you don't end up being the fellow. Remember who your audience is. If we're writing policy work, there's a good chance that the person that's reading it isn't a scientist. So you don't need to go into the same level of technical detail, frankly, because they're not going to understand it. But also there's the question, which is to what end? Why is what you're writing important to the reader? And it's important to me to see the connection made, because that's how we're going to find out what we're writing is actually more useful to people if we make all of the connections for them and make it more easily digestible in that way. So those are some tips too. You can also visit, Chris's blog, the Policy Blotter, which is a link to on our website. If you go to ASBMB today, you can see our monthly pieces that are written, and there's another area where you can see examples of what it is that's written for our policy activities here.
So I have a question. With all the current gridlock that you have, or that we see in Congress right now, is there specific legislators that you target in order to work with, or do you just work across the board with everyone?
We work with everyone. Science funding is a bipartisan issue. It's not partisan. ASBMB is a nonprofit society. We're not partisan, so it's really important that we stay bipartisan on things. Who do we work with? The chairs of the committees that are important to us. So, if it's funding, it's, the appropriations committee that handles the NIH portfolio. So the chair of that committee, the ranking member of that committee, and then the people who represent our members. So, Geoff and Chris have mentioned our PAC. That's 15 people. That's 15 members of Congress that we try to work with regularly because we know that they're there. And we want them to know, we want the member of Congress to know what's going on in their own backyard. So the short answer is no. There's not a specific person, we will talk with and meet with anybody. But as you're here and as you kind of learn that, some members are gatekeepers, you need to talk to this person in order to really have any influence. And those are the people that we tend to target.
And do you feel that you have influence?
Influence in policy is measured, is difficult to measure. So that's the one thing I would say is if you expect to be able to turn around and know exactly what you did and the impact that it had, you're going to find yourself disappointed often. That's the frustrating thing about the job. So, in Washington, success is the child of 100 fathers, and failure is an orphan. So nobody has anything to do with anything that doesn't work. But there are things that you can look into and see. For instance, the president, for the past 3 months or so, just about every speech that he's made, particularly speeches that talk about funding, has made some reference to science and biomedical research or, biomedical grants or something along those lines. And I can't say that's because I met with someone who told the president, Ben Corbett, ASBMB says you need to mention this. But I can tell you that everything that the president says doesn't happen by accident. Those aren't things that he just picks off the top of his head. Those are made because, the scientific community has been very vocal and supportive of the need for a balanced approach to deficit reduction, yada, 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 yada. So there are ways that we can find the connection to things, but it's rarely you can point back and say that happened simply because we did something. But you'll find we will do an awful lot to try and move the needle as much as possible. Right, I am going to go away and go back to work and let these guys say things about me again. But it was nice talking to you all briefly. And I certainly hope that we will see at least your applications, if not many more from that. So thank you and enjoy them for the rest of the time.
Thank you, Ben.
All right.
Actually, we can't say bad things about him because it's being broadcast to YouTube. You can go back and do it.
Yeah, he's watching it right now.
Yeah.
So in terms of, future jobs and policy, I know most of the jobs are in the DC area, but in your guys' experience in terms of trying to find the next step, what kind of opportunities are there in other states? Like, are you always just confined to DC?
No. DC is for federally focused advocacy. You can do it at the state level. So I know that both California and Massachusetts have science policy fellowships where you'd work with the state legislatures there. It just depends on what you want to work on. So the AAU, the American Association of Universities, is based here in DC, but obviously they have members all across the country at the different university institutions, and there are numbers of those. And those groups have a lot of advocacy efforts that go on both on the federal level, but also, of course, on the state and local level, because that's where they're being impacted. On average, yes, you're going to find more policy-themed jobs in DC, but it's not the exclusive domain.
Yeah, and not even fellowships, but going to states that have vocally invested in in biomedical research, like California or Texas or Massachusetts or things like that. You might be able to just find a job in the government there or in some other organization that's doing something similar that we do on the national level, but they do it at a state level. And as Geoff said, a lot of universities have governmental affairs offices or some kind of public relations, something like that, and you might be able to get into that kind of office. So you can come to DC and do the fellowship and then move on to a career in policy, but at one of those institutions away from DC, if that's what you want.
So you guys are a nonprofit organization. Do you interact with other nonprofits during the fellowship
Yeah, all the time.
Okay.
Most of the organizations in town are nonprofits. So any of the partners that we have, whether it be ASCB, AAAS, a lot of those other organizations. Actually, I'm not sure about AAAS, but a lot of them are nonprofits, just advocating on behalf of scientific research.
Yeah, so, my research has more to do with, it falls under cell biology, so I've had more experience with ASCB. Is that a problem when applying for the ASBMB?
Hate them. No, it's not a problem at all. I mean, everybody's on the same team.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll mention FASIB, which is the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, is an umbrella organization from 27 different scientific societies.
Mm-hmm.
We are one of the larger ones. They have a weekly public affairs meeting that Chris gets to sit through. We do a lot of work with FASIB through FASIB, all constant interaction.
So that would be interactions with the AAI, which is an immunology organization, GSA, which is genetics, physiologists, pretty much anything that you might want.
Pharmacologists,
they're all there.
So since a lot of policy work probably deals with budgets and money, and that's always what Congress is interested in, does part of the training involve things like that? How to look at a budget, how to break it down, how to approach people that we're trying to influence, put it in terms of money, since that's probably what they're more interested in.
Why don't you get one of your fact sheets?
Yeah. So we don't break down budgets or anything like that. Normally what the community does is they come up with a number. Everybody in the community knows what the NIH appropriation is. Right now it's $30.6 billion for fiscal year 12, even though we're in 13, they've done some budget gimmicks so that it's still $30.6 billion. And we're always looking for a modest increase to NIH funding because there are more and more researchers that we need to support. So we normally circle in on a number of $32 billion, at least that's what it's been for the last couple of years. But we don't actually go and break down a budget and say X should go here and Y should go here. We normally try and look at it more broadly as far as NIH and NSF are going to go. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could learn more about the budget. It's what we talk about a lot here in Washington, but it can also be a headache. I'm pretty sure I've woken up typing sequestration just, on my keyboard in bed because I've written about sequestration so much. So you're going to learn a lot about the budget and the things that the government does to put money in different places, but there's no formal training on budgeting.
I guess I'd say, as an example, since Chris said he was interested in STEM education and training, it was something else I was interested in. One of the ideas is not so much about increasing funding, but shifting where the money goes and how it's used. So would that be an example of something the organization would do or that we would do during the fellowship?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just jump in and say that when I started, one of the first projects that I worked on, and this is on our website, was a white paper aimed at the NIH about how to best use its resources. And some of the recommendations from that white paper involve shifting funding priorities within the NIH itself, away from certain kinds of projects and certain kinds of certain institutes towards other focuses for the institute as a whole. I'm sure Chris has too. The agencies all have their budget releases every year where they come out with, this is our big program and this is what we're going to fund and all that. So you get to see it from their perspective, and then you can provide, there's sort of a back and forth between the members of the community and the agencies about whether they think that's a proper use of their funding.
But you're also not going to get, I don't know what level you're thinking about here, but you're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of saying, really, we should be spending, $20 million more in this area instead of this other area. We try not to get that far down into it. We, like Geoff said, try to use language like, we should shift our priorities towards this and let the agency figure out what that means to them. Similarly, when you go to Capitol Hill, we say we want $32 billion for NIH, but we're not going to tell them where to take that money from because that only makes us enemies of all of those other programs. And we're trying not to make enemies and to stay bipartisan in that. So there is a bit of a fine line. You have to learn the language. That's part of also the learning curve, is learning the language to use. The first several blogs that I wrote, Ben, went through it with a red pen and, told me the things that I couldn't use because either I was being partisan or I wasn't being clear, and things like that. So, yeah, I hope that answered your question.
No, it does.
Are there any other questions that we can answer for you guys?
Actually, this is one more practical question. If the application is due March 29th, do you guys have a estimate on what date you would announce who's getting the fellowship?
I don't know. Ben and I haven't gotten that far yet as far as figuring out dates. Like I said, we have a Hill Day coming up in the middle of March, so that's taking all of our attention right now as the fellowship applications filter in. We will probably, once we clear the deadline, we'll sit down and figure out a time to go over them. And the application process is actually 2 rounds, so we will do a round of phone interviews and then probably a second round. Actually, that might not be accurate. I think Ben was trying to. Oh, here's Ben again.
He's coming back. May.
May. Yeah, here's May.
Yeah, so it usually takes about a month to sort of go through all the different applications, and then Chris says go through the different rounds of the interviews. You'll interview with Ben and Chris, and then you'll interview with the full Public Affairs Committee to get their input.
Are we?
Sorry, go ahead. Well, you mentioned Hill Day a couple of times. So is that already full?
Yeah, that is. We opened up registration back in February, and we bring in 19 or 20 people from around the nation to do that. We normally have them twice a year. The other one would be in September. We're not sure if we're going to do the September one again, but we will definitely have it again next March. But that said, you can still go and meet with your representatives or senators' offices wherever you live.
I've done that, but it's kind of they really don't get back to you when you call or email or leave messages.
There was another question?
Oh, I was just wondering, as we go through the application process, because I've applied for some other policy fellowships, and are we free to contact you guys if we have any questions about the application or anything like that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, if you ask a question that crosses the line, we'll tell you. That.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be like, hey, does this sound great? But just like details about stuff, because other places have been really helpful. I just didn't know, since there's less people involved in this, it seems like that how busy you guys are, how available you are for quick questions.
We try to respond fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
All right. I guess that's it. Thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and like Chris said, let us know if you have future questions. We'd be happy to answer them.
Okay. Thank you, Geoff and Chris.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.